Bandwidth for changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com. We move fast and fix things here at changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. And we're hosted on Linode Cloud servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. This episode is brought to you by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean's developer cloud makes it simple to launch in the cloud and scale up as you grow. They have an intuitive control panel, predictable pricing, team accounts, worldwide availability with a 99.99 uptime SLA, and 24/7, 365 world-class support to back that up. DigitalOcean makes it easy to deploy, scale, store, secure, and monitor your cloud environments. Head to do.co/changelog to get started with a $100 credit. Again, do.co/changelog.
Welcome to JS Party, your weekly celebration of JavaScript and the web. We record the show in front of a live internet audience on Thursdays at 1 p.m. Eastern. Join in the hijinks at changelog.com/live and join the community for free and Slack with us during the show at changelog.com/community. Okay, let's do this. Party time, y'all.
Hello and welcome to another exciting party, your JavaScript party. It's JS Party time. I'm your host today, Nick Nisi, and I'm joined by my fellow co-host, K-Ball. K-Ball, what's up?
Hey, hey.
And we also have the amazing Bone Skull, aka Chris Hiller. How's it going, Chris?
Super, how you doing?
Oh, I'm doing well. And we are talking all things Gatsby today. And with that, we have from Gatsby, Dustin Schau. Dustin, welcome to the show.
Hey everyone, yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Really excited to talk about Gatsby. So we did actually have an episode with Jason Langsdorff a year ago about where we talked about Gatsby and kind of introed it. And so just kind of to summarize that, can you give us a brief summary of what Gatsby is?
Yeah, of course. So Gatsby is kind of interesting to describe because I think the mental model that most people hold for Gatsby is that of the like static site generator. So people will say, oh, it's kind of like Jekyll or it's kind of like 11D. And like that piece is true. You know, Gatsby is like an excellent static site generator. But I really think of Gatsby as like a progressive app compiler. So one of the key ideas of Gatsby is that you can source data from anywhere. And then the other key idea is you want to compile ahead of time as much as possible. So the idea with Gatsby is, you know, source data from, you know, insert CMS here, WordPress, Drupal, Contentful, what have you. Stitch it together with GraphQL. So I think our data layer is like a key piece of what makes Gatsby so interesting. And then produce kind of like a read-only clone, basically the static site at build time. And so, you know, Gatsby does generate sites statically. You can write your application with React, with GraphQL. And yeah, you get a super fast website as a result that your users will love.
Nice. So it's pretty much made up of those two. Would you condense that into two big pieces, the data layer and then the static site layer that feeds from the data layer?
I think that's pretty fair. I think it's, you know, React as the presentation layer and then GraphQL as the data layer, and then it's stitching them together and then compiling them to static HTML. What's really cool and like why Gatsby isn't, you know, just a quote unquote static site generator is that there's also a runtime that gets shipped, which people have thoughts and opinions on, so, of course, but maybe we can get into that later. But the idea is that, you know, once it hits the browser, everything has been optimized as much as possible. But then it's a fully functional, like dynamic React runtime, so that you can, you know, make data requests, you can do interactions, you can, you know, do whatever you can in a React application because it produces a React application.
I have a question about that, jumping in already. So one thing, first off, I love the way that we're moving to compile time stuff, and we're kind of pre-compiling everything and doing this sort of static site plus approach. But one thing that has come up a couple of times is that often that creates sort of an interactivity gap. So rather than the traditional SPA approach of you get a loading screen, you're waiting, and then you get something that you can interact with right away. Mm-hmm. We show the user a page right away because we're shipping out compiled HTML. Mm-hmm. But sometimes we're lying because when you try to interact with it, it doesn't work until the thing fully hydrates. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious if Gatsby's doing anything. Well, first off, how big of a problem does that end up being with Gatsby sites? Like, what's that interactivity gap look like in terms of time? And then two, if there's anything on the radar to address that.
For sure. So are you kind of referring to like metrics like TTI? So, you know, like it looks like it might be ready, but I'm still waiting for like JavaScript to load in the background and, you know, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So Yeah, I mean, our runtime and, what we ship, again, is we want to just ship the minimal amount of content, so HTML, JavaScript, CSS, etc., to the end user so that it is as interactive as possible. As a result, most Gatsby sites you'll see out in the wild, they have like hundreds across the board in Lighthouse. So as far as your actual question, it's really no different than it is in like a React application. So if you're going to ship bunch and like gobs of JavaScript that like are required for that initial experience, it's still kind of up to the developer to kind of use discretion here. And so in general, I think the problem is less impactful in Gatsby because, again, we do compile ahead of time what can be compiled ahead of time. And, if like some dynamic interaction or, something is loading in the background, generally that's not required for the initial experience. And so, yeah, I haven't seen this as much of a problem in the Gatsby space as I've seen it in other different areas. Yeah, that's a really great question.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we often measure that time to interactive. And in fact, I think Lighthouse shows the time to interactive. And one of the really interesting questions I think Adi Asmani published about was the gap between paint time and interactive is in some ways almost more interesting than just what is that time to interactive, because that's this sort of uncanny valley period where it feels like we should be able to interact with it, but we can't yet.
Yeah, Eddie is amazing. So, I mean, if you haven't seen his like cost of JavaScript, I'm sure you have. I used one of his like GIFs in like some of my slides in the past. But yeah, exactly what you're describing is, the user might see this like shell that looks like it can be interacted with. And so they'll click things. And, the classic example is like Amazon. So it looks like Amazon's loading. You're trying to like type in the search bar, but you're still waiting for JavaScript to load. So, in general, I think the approach is just load as minimal amount of JavaScript as you can. And so, but yeah, I think that's a really great metric. Like we almost need a secondary metric that's in between those two, because that is a really frustrating end user experience.
So how much JavaScript do you end up shipping, in a vanilla Gatsby app if I'm not doing very much?
That's a really great question. Again, I'm glad you're asking it. I mean, most of our runtime is React. And so React ends up being, last I checked, I think it's at like 30 to 50K gzipped. And then our runtime itself is like 10 to 15. And that also includes the router. And so I think total, it's like 57 or 58 kilobytes gzipped. What is kind of cool is because we have such a pluggable ecosystem, which I should have sold that earlier on. I think that's another thing that's really great about Gatsby. There's a great plugin called Gatsby Plugin Preact. I saw Andy Bell tweet about it recently. And so, Preact is doing largely the same kind of like VDOM stuff that React is doing, but also comes in like a much smaller file size. You can drop your bundle size just by switching to that.
And do you have to use the JavaScript bundle?
I mean, I think it's worth it. There's a really, really great article that one of my coworkers, Mikkel, recently wrote on like why Gatsby is better with JavaScript. And so we do things like preloading and prefetching so that it makes the actual experience not only faster, but it like feels faster. And so, of course, that requires JavaScript. So in general, I think it's absolutely worth it. I don't even really like to publicize it, but there is a Gatsby plugin that removes the JavaScript. But I think for us, most applications that, real world applications you're going to ship to an end user, they require at least some JavaScript. And because I think React is, the best kind of implementation of how I want to write my UIs, which I hope isn't too contentious of a take, but I'm sure people have thoughts and opinions on that. It makes a lot of sense to me that that I'm going to, want to use some JavaScript in my applications. Yeah. Yeah. Not a very surprising take from, someone who works at Gatsby that I'm a big fan of React.
Yeah. Though I would wonder, so I hit you with questions early on, but don't get me wrong. I love Gatsby. I love what y'all are doing.
These are great questions. I'm like glad you're asking them. They're not easy,
No, and I think they're questions that we need to address broadly as an ecosystem. And I think one big area that I'd be curious on, I don't think there's a good React solution for this yet, but maybe there is exploring the potential for progressive hydration. I don't know if that's something that maybe Gatsby could add a layer related to or something, but essentially thinking about the hydration process as a top-down approach, saying, okay, well, the things that are on screen to start with need to be hydrated first, and maybe we can wait until some of the other things come into screen before we do that, pay the cost of all that JavaScript.
Definitely. There's a lot of interesting ideas in this space. And so for us, like, it's definitely something we're interested in. To be totally honest, like it's something that, we hope the React team helps us out with. And, they kind of paint a better picture there. One really interesting space that we've done a little bit of exploration is kind of like that very thing. And I've seen some other frameworks, SSGs, et cetera, that do this idea of everything that you render will be static, and then you use a separate component that's like, this is then dynamic. And so I think that's a really cool idea, and it's very much in line with kind of what you're saying. But as far as like whether we're going to do that, in Gatsby, probably not anytime soon, but I do think it's a very, very interesting and exciting space. And, as React kind of moves into that, us, using React and having first class support for React means we'll kind of get that for free, if and when that comes around.
Can you build a Gatsby site with Rome?
With Rome?
I'm joking.
Oh my gosh. I was thinking Rome, the note-taking tool. You mean Rome, the new bundler, everything, do all things well, that launched yesterday. Actually, it's funny. In Slack, there's a pretty good thread on it already. So we're definitely aware of it. It's an awesome, awesome tool. I haven't used it myself, but you never know.
He's joking about a tool that came out yesterday, and you're saying you already have discussions ongoing about it. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I haven't heard about this. What is it?
What's his name?
Sebastian McKenzie.
He open sourced it last night, and so it's just kind of it's just a code dump right now. So it's very new, is what I'm saying. Like less than 24 hours ago. So.
Yeah, that was you're kind of trying to catch me off guard, making sure I know my JS ecosystem.
Well, yeah, you'd know if you were probably paying attention to Hacker News or Twitter or something.
For sure. Yeah. Again, I haven't used it. I think there are a lot of things that
nobody has is the thing. So
there are things that other tools can be inspired from in that, and so I've been following his work on that for the last year or two. The first class support for error messages and the emphasis he placed on really clear, solid error messages. I think that's something that every framework, every JavaScript tool should strive towards. And so I've been, definitely interested in that space. And, when and if that we can use it for something, I'll definitely be checking it out.
Does raise kind of an interesting pluggability question around Gatsby. So one thing that you highlighted that I think is really important to think about is Gatsby has these two conceptual layers. There's a very interesting data pipelining layer that does a lot of interesting stuff and packages things up into GraphQL. And then there's a React-based view layer. Do you see any possibility that those two things might be separated and you could have someone be building a Vue.js or Svelte or something else based view layer on top of the GraphQL data pipeline?
It's a great question. If I recall correctly, Sarah Drasner from Vue opened up an issue on GitHub a while ago, kind of asking that very question. And so to me, to be totally frank, I think React's the way that applications, should generally be written. But our idea of sourcing data from anywhere, it is kind of very much, an interesting space of, not only can you source data from anywhere, but then you can also output it using whatever mechanism you want. And so from a product perspective, it's a little challenging because a lot of what we're doing, is React code. And so our runtime would then kind of need to be forked into different languages, different frameworks. So is it something that could be done? Yes. Is it something that we plan to do at this time? No. But based on, I've definitely been monitoring the Vue space closely. They're doing a lot of really cool stuff. Svelte is awesome. Rich Harris is incredible. Well worth the follow on Twitter. If anyone doesn't follow him, he's amazing. But I think we'd be foolish to not at least keep that option on the table. But it's not something that we're planning to do now.
I mean, it seems to me so much of the Gatsby ecosystem is married to JSX, and there's MDX and everything. It's really hard to kind of separate the two at this point. Mm-hmm. I mean, is it something people really want or need? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing is, it's kind of how we prioritize, how many people are actually asking for this? How closely is the user of Svelte? Is that even a user of Gatsby ever? Definitely not today because literally not possible. But, future state, if that were possible, is there even an overlap or intersection there? And so, yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, it'd definitely be cool to do someday, especially if, the competitive landscape changes and, React isn't the way people write their UIs. I started my career as a front-end dev and I was writing jQuery mobile. And a year later, it was Angular. And then, now it's not Angular anymore for me. So the landscape changes fast. I think React's here to stay. I think it's kind of stabilized. And it feels to me that are using React, Angular, Vue. Maybe some people are using Svelte. But it's definitely an interesting space to keep monitoring.
I wonder if we could invert it and say, instead of saying Gatsby has to support all these view layers, instead saying Gatsby is going to, and maybe you already do this, but clarify the interface into the data layer such that someone else could pull that in and use it for a different framework, but not having it be something that is like, okay, Gatsby now has to do all these things, change the runtime, but rather you have Gatsby data and Gatsby UI or whatever it is.
That's a really, really interesting idea. And so for context, one thing I didn't necessarily mention explicitly for viewers, I guess, is Gatsby invokes GraphQL queries at build time. And so that's the data layer that we're referring. So you write your GraphQL query alongside your React component, and then your React component gets injected with this data. Yeah, it's a super interesting idea on whether we could abstract our data layer into just like a data pipeline and then swap out the presentation layer. Again, not something on our roadmap, not something we're thinking about now, but I think it's a really interesting idea.
That also raises, you talked about roadmap a couple times. You've introduced a new process for how you think about roadmap and what's going to happen. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. So Gatsby has like a really thriving community and a thriving ecosystem. We lovingly refer to it as like our GitHub fire hose. So like tons and tons of pull requests, tons and tons of issues that is just honestly fairly challenging, but like really rewarding to stay on top of. And so one thing that, we haven't as of yet captured, at least not like on like a broader scale, is so we have, I think last I checked, like 3,000-ish contributors to Gatsby, which is pretty incredible. And most of the contributions we get, which are always valuable, are like documentation, tests, what I'd call smaller changes. I think we've maybe missed the mark on, or that we could definitely use some help with from the community, is, broader chunks of work. And so the RFC process is, how other spaces do this. So React has an RFC process. Next.js, a similar React framework in the same kind of space we're in, has an RFC process. And so our RFC process, like, it's really not so much something necessarily new. It's a tweak on the model. So we had it as a separate repo. We found as open source maintainers, it's really hard to keep a pulse on, disparate repos, like outside of the main Gatsby flow. And so what we're really looking for is, more eyes on these RFCs by internalizing them into our main monorepo. It's kind of, people look at the Gatsby monorepo, sometimes it's a bit overwhelming, but it's, literally everything we do is in that monorepo. So, we have our starters there. We have all of our Gatsby packages as like a learner monorepo. And then now we'll have RFCs that, if and when they get merged, you can help shape the Gatsby roadmap and propose like a chunk of work that will benefit the broader Gatsby ecosystem. So super exciting process that we're beginning to kind of, experiment with and roll out, and we'll kind of see whether we see some success with it. And so, yeah, my call to action, for our community is, if you have a, great idea, something that you really wanted to be possible in Gatsby, and you have some, insight into maybe implementing it, we'd love to see some more RFCs, love to see some chunks of work proposed. And I think it's a super exciting thing as a contributor because, you'll get tons of replies from our direct open source maintainer line, and we can help guide what this feature could look like, when we should do it, et cetera, et cetera.
So you mentioned the broad community around Gatsby, which is wonderful, but Gatsby also is kind of tightly associated in some ways with the company, Gatsby, or Gatsby. I don't know how you distinguish the names. Gatsby Inc., I guess?
Yeah. Yep.
How much of the core team is embedded within that company, and how much, are there folks who are not connected with the company who are on the core team?
So the core team, as we refer to it, is Gatsby employees. Although we do, once you merge a PR once you get a PR merged into the Gatsby repo, you become a maintainer, and that gives you a certain level of access in the repo. As far as what percentage, so for total context, so Gatsby is an open source product, is free, will always be free. And then we have cloud tooling that we can maybe get into in a little bit that, as I kind of describe it, it makes using the Gatsby open source tool better and easier for teams. And so as far as the breakdown, I think last I checked, 30 to 50% of the company is open source. There's a really great blog post that actually goes into detail on, we're doubling down on the open source ecosystem. So yeah, open source is and will always be a focus. And it's, a focus of our hiring. It's a focus on, all of what we do. And then that work directly leads into a better experience for everyone. And then cloud also, of course, uses the open source product as well. So, we want our product good for everyone, including ourselves.
Algolia powers our search on changelog.com. They're also trusted by awesome companies like Stripe, Twitch, and Slack. If you're going Jamstack, add Algolia to the list of APIs you rely upon for search and discovery. They have an awesome developer experience, excellent docs complete with interactive tutorials, an easy-to-use JavaScript client, instant search widgets for React, Vue, Angular, and integrations into all the common backend frameworks. Check Algolia out today using the link in the show notes or head to algolia.com to learn more.
So kind of talking about the open source versus the business side, you did mention that there's this whole cloud aspect of Gatsby. Do you want to give us an intro into what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So our cloud product is really composed of a couple products. The kind of elevator pitch of what I would say Gatsby Cloud is, as far as kind of what I just said, like Gatsby Cloud makes using Gatsby, particularly for like larger applications and like teams of developers working on a Gatsby application, like better and easier to use. So one thing that I've kind of hinted at or like shown is I've mentioned how Gatsby plays really nicely with several CMSs, so Contentful, WordPress, etc. And so one of the key things that we're seeing is that the CMS is moving towards decoupled. So the CMS is moving towards headless. And so Gatsby is like excellently positioned in this space to be able to source data from these headless CMSs, using these APIs, stitch it together with this GraphQL API, and then produce this application. But when you decouple your CMS from your presentation layer, you're kind of leaving your content editors, your marketers, your people who are actually using these CMSs a little bit stranded. And so our cloud product, as I see it, it's making the pitch for the developer who's kind of bringing in Gatsby as a tool as easy as possible. So our first two products are Preview. So the idea is that Preview is like a hot reloading Gatsby application that lives in the cloud. And so your content editors can preview their content in context. So if you're writing a blog post, writing a press release, etc., you can click this preview button. This will link to a hosted Gatsby application that will then preview your changes in honestly usually like a couple hundred milliseconds, but sub 5 seconds is what we strive for. And so the idea is that we're replicating the CMS experience kind of like piece by piece. Sorry, were you asking a question?
Yeah, digging into that, where would they actually be making those changes? Like, where would you be drafting a blog post? Is it on Gatsby Cloud itself, or is it on like a CMS that's third party?
It's a great question. So you would be making the changes directly on the CMS today. And so like one of our most common partners or most common CMSs that people use with Gatsby is Contentful. And so, the idea is, use the tools that you like to be effective and like keep using them depending on who you are. So it's like, I don't want to pry WordPress, from my content editor's hands. Like use the tools that you like and then stitch them together, stitch these tools outputs, basically content, data, and then stitch them together with the Gatsby application, the Gatsby framework. And so, the typical workflow is keep using the tools you like, pull the data with GraphQL with a Gatsby source plugin, and then basically give the same experience to your content editors with a better user experience of, I'm not using my WordPress for hosting. I'm not spending $8K and putting like a varnished edge cache layer, put it on a CDN, produce static assets. I think it's a much better model and a much cheaper model and a better user experience, I think, as well. Yeah.
Is there like a hook that Gatsby Cloud listens to for like, I saved a draft of this blog post, now generate a new version?
Exactly. Yeah. It's behind the scenes, as with many things, it's just webhooks. So we expose, one thing I didn't get into is, so that's just Preview. The CMS experience is more than Preview, it's also Publish. And so our builds product is, the fastest builds for Gatsby in the cloud. And so when you publish content, you then trigger a build webhook, which can then optionally also deploy to like a CDN, like Netlify, S3 and CloudFront, Google Cloud, etc. And so, to your question though, for Contentful, let's say they have this draft mode, you're making some changes to copy, that will trigger the Gatsby Preview webhook, which will then hot reload the changes in place and context, which is pretty cool.
You brought up Netlify, and a lot of the features that you're mentioning here remind me of Netlify. So how do you see yourself as different from them, particularly for somebody who's hosting or wanting to build a Gatsby focused app?
Yeah. So I think in a lot of ways, what our cloud offering is doing is pretty similar to Netlify. So our builds product is continuous deployment in the same way that Netlify has continuous deployment. I think the big difference is that Netlify is a CD solution for any application. They're pretty agnostic, whereas we are a CD application and more, kind of replicating the CMS for just Gatsby. So I think the interesting thing is that, we can do some things in the open source product that, then impact cloud in, of course, positive sense. And so really Netlify is kind of like a generalist who's building out any application. And then Gatsby is specializing in delivering Gatsby applications. And the use cases for instance, what could be built on Netlify could be different. And so, we're kind of capturing the CMS space, and that really isn't necessarily, and that includes like preview, and that isn't necessarily a space that Netlify has touched as much. So, we're kind of making a platform for, collaboration for teams using Gatsby, and it's a little bit different than, of course, than Netlify, which is, building. And so the really cool thing that I think is awesome is that, Netlify is an awesome tool, like recommend it super highly, but it also exposes like a CDN. And so the cool thing is that with Gatsby Cloud, you can build your application, with our cloud platform, and then you can even deploy to Netlify because we produce static assets that can be deployed anywhere, which is pretty cool.
So that lets you, like, being more specific with Gatsby Cloud, that lets you specifically tailor that experience to the Gatsby experience. So one of the things that probably is a big benefit over something more generic like Netlify, from what I've been reading, is builds. And specifically, builds are a lot faster on there. Can you go into why that is?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. It's a great illustration of, kind of what we can do with being more of a specialist in Gatsby applications. So what we launched on the 27th was actually January 27th was our builds product. And so that was, kind of painting the picture for completion of Gatsby Cloud. And so what we launched on that day is what we call distributed builds. And so what that enables, or, what that enabled is, of course, faster builds. But the how of how we did that is the open source product exposed the communication mechanism over IPC. And then cloud can then listen to that communication mechanism and then offload work to cloud. So it's really just Lambda functions behind the scenes. And so what that's doing is offloading heavy work off of the main core process, single threaded node, into a cloud environment. And so what we did is that one of the heaviest and potentially slowest pieces of a Gatsby build is generating responsive images, which again is worth it. That's something that your users want. If anyone hasn't checked out the Gatsby image component, check it out. That's kind of that's why you are generating these images. And so what you'd often find is that builds were timing out, or they were taking like 10, 15 minutes for generating just the images alone. And so by offloading it to the cloud platform, we can, one, build out your application faster. And then two, especially on like subsequent builds, we just short circuit that work that we've already done. So you don't redo work that you oftentimes do on other platforms.
Can you somehow use this in a local build to speed up a local build?
It's a really great question, and it's something that we definitely want to do. So that same communication mechanism that we enable, future state, I think we could totally just offload that to those same functions in the cloud from your local machine. So you're asking a lot of really good questions that are kind of highlighting our future deliverables. So it's a really good question.
Interesting. So can I dig in a little bit more? You mentioned that you can reuse stuff from the previous build. So does that mean you've gotten to the point where you can do like complete incremental builds?
We're getting close. So incremental build has been, and I think will be, the holy grail for quote unquote static site generators for a really long time. And so for context,
yes,
what incremental builds is, I think requires some nuance, but I think the mental model that everyone holds is I add a blog post, I just build out that blog post, not my entire application. And so what's really incredible about that is it unblocks, using quote unquote static site generators for like more and more interesting use cases. And so like one of the most common is, one of the most common complaints we hear of users of Gatsby is, well, I have 1 million pages and I don't want to wait 35, 40, minutes for my build to complete when I just am changing a blog post. Or, I have real-time edits. My content editors are making changes every 10, 5, 1 second, and I can't wait for my build to complete. So what incremental build does is, really as I think of it, quite simply, is just fast builds. And so the ultimate goal is that builds are kind of just this seamless, obvious thing that just happen. And so it's something, that we're definitely working on, and we hope to have more to share on that soon. But it's a super, super interesting space, and it's honestly what I think tons and tons of users have been asking for since like the entirety of Gatsby as a tool. And so anyone who kind of decouples their content from their presentation layer, so using an SSG, has asked for this. Like every framework, you could probably go through GitHub issues for anyone and be like, what about incremental builds?
100%. I know you just said that you're going to have some announcements soon, but I'd love to poke a little bit at the details there. And if you can't talk about it, you can't. But I think one interesting thing about that is that different types of increments may be differently difficult. So changing content within a page is potentially much easier to isolate than adding a new page, because adding a new page then has to touch anything that links to it automatically, indexing, anything like that. Whereas within a page, it may be easier to isolate. So I'm curious, as you look towards this, do you think you're going to be able to get to a fully general solution, or is it going to work for particular use cases or things like that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this question. I think one of the most interesting things about Gatsby isn't the presentation layer, although I think that's great. It's the data layer. And so because we own that data layer, we can then associate which components, which pages then require which data. And so, if I'm a user of Contentful and I add a blog post, I can then know like what work I need to do to like basically make the site consistent. And so a new blog post is, a fairly trivial use case. But let's say I'm editing, an existing blog post. Like that data is going to come through. We'll kind of like diff in the same way, in some sense that like React diffs. And then we'll just generate that page that needs to be updated instead of, the entire application. There are edge cases here. Like I don't want to portray a silver bullet like scenario ever, because you could make a data change that then invalidates the entire application. So for instance, I might have a footer component that has data sourced from Contentful or WordPress or whatever. That change would then invalidate, every single page, which then means the application is regenerated. So again, an interesting space where it's like, we want to keep driving down, driving towards more and more incremental cases. And so, yeah, super interesting space. And yeah, definitely something that we're exploring and working on.
Interesting. So to kind of dig into that idea a little bit more. So you're talking about essentially creating, if you think about the virtual DOM as creating a dependency tree of templates to what's happening, you're thinking about that in terms of your GraphQL layer. You could create I don't know what you'd call that, a virtual data layer or something that keeps track of the dependencies between different data points. So you understand if this changes, here's the minimal set of changes that has to be re-rendered.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that this is how preview works. So I was mentioning earlier a tool called Gatsby Preview. Like that's the central mechanism that enables that quote unquote hot reloading. And so it's, we have this big blob of data, let's say, this tree of data. And so the idea is that so we know what components are plucking from this tree, and those are the components that we re-render. And so the idea is that preview is re-rendering like hot reloading, in the cloud. Incremental builds is re-rendering the build process. And so it's like, just do this work because we know which pages require which pieces of data.
Is that utilizing React's DOM diffing to effectively do that? Like saying, oh, you have these components and these props on them have effectively changed, so I need to re-render this.
Just kind of like an analogy. Yeah. It's like it diffs in like it's a diff in the same way, or in the same way that React's kind of like diffing.
Gotcha.
And actually, like if Sebastian McKenzie was listening to this, I know they've talked a lot about how it's not just like a VDOM diff. There's more nuance to it. But I'm just saying that it's entire data set, which components require which data. So we'll kind of diff what changed between what was previous state of the world to the new state of the world.
Cool.
Is that diffing tool intended to be part of what is open sourced as a part of Gatsby, or is that maintaining proprietary to the Gatsby Inc.?
Yeah, great question. So incremental builds requires cloud tooling to kind of be an effective solution today. And so in the future, we definitely want to at least again explore that space to see what's possible in open source. So you mentioned a couple of things that I think are really interesting. So like earlier there was, could we use distributed builds locally? And the answer is, not today, but it is something that we want to keep exploring because again, it's a really, really exciting space. One kind of like note here is that it's like a super generous free tier, just like other platforms. So you will be able to, use all of these features in Gatsby Cloud on a free tier in general.
Yeah, I'm imagining 2 or 3 steps down the line. So if that diffing tool becomes a part of the open source product, so you have this concept of the data layer that includes a way to understand for any data change what is the set of dependent pieces of data that are changing. And you get to that point where you're separating out the data layer as a package that could be reused for other frameworks. Like you've just enabled the next generation of static site generators across every framework, not just across one.
Yeah, that's. I'm glad I'm here on this podcast because you have a lot of really, really excellent ideas that I definitely want to explore more. So the answer is we haven't explored that particular space yet, but something to definitely think about for sure.
I feel like I'm talking a lot. Anybody else want to jump on this?
You mentioned one thing that Gatsby Cloud does is image processing. What is it doing specifically?
Yeah, no, that's great. I hope people don't mind that I'm like super diving into the how because this is really exciting. So we use an open source product called Sharp. And so Sharp is just a node image processing library. And so what we do is, I'll start with like the simplest example. You might have a markdown file that has a link to a local image. That image is going to exist in your GitHub repo. That image might be a 5 megabyte JPEG, And so just by linking to that image as like an image with a source tag, you're shipping a 5 megabyte image to your end users. That's not what your users want. And so they don't know that they don't want that, but they don't want that. So what we do is using this GraphQL layer and utilizing this plugin ecosystem, we use this library Sharp. We'll take this image and then generate the GraphQL query. And then we'll generate the different image sizes. And so different viewports, different DPIs, etc. And then that GraphQL query will contain a data shape that you can then directly pass to the Gatsby image component. That data shape includes things like source set, etc. And then so Gatsby image constructs a picture element with a source and then a source set. And so this image transformation, what it's doing is it's generating images in, I believe, 3 or 4 different variants and different sizes. It's optimizing them, it's compressing them so that the end user experience, if you've seen a Gatsby application, you'll see this like medium like blur effect. So at build time, we just do the base 64 image. So it's super small. And then with an intersection observer, once you scroll that image into the viewport, you then load in the image that you need for your viewport. So on mobile, you'll get a smaller image. On desktop, you'll get a larger image. But the end user experience is that it's happening, behind the scenes using this JavaScript layer. And then, it's loading just what you need when you need it. I kind of think of Gatsby in like this particular example as like a friendly butler. Like, hey, I think you might need this. Okay, cool. Now it's ready. And so we're trying to guess, using smart optimizations when something is ready based on when the user requests it.
Are those image sizes and variants dependent on how I'm using the image in the app? Like, is it, if it knows that it's like a big banner image, so it should have a really big size, is it detecting like the actual size that it would be in the viewport and then doing that?
Yeah, it's a great question too. It's all configurable. So because this is the mechanism for when these images are created is a GraphQL query. The GraphQL query just takes arguments. And so the arguments could be, so for like a hero image, you might say, well, my users are typically on like a 1200 to 1500 pixel monitor. So my max width, this actual arg name, will be 1200, which will be pixels. So that'll be the largest image that you create. And then of course it'll like stretch because it's an image based on, however large you make it or however small you make it. So it's totally, in some sense manual, but it's like giving the developer the control as to where this image is used in context. So like, you can use Gatsby image in this image transformation layer for like what are called fixed images. So think like an avatar as well. So, you still are only loading the small, like, less than 1 kilobyte image at load. And then you're loading in the full image, when you scroll down to it or when you request it.
Is that image API, I think I missed this, is that something that is specific to the Gatsby Cloud version?
Nope, it's totally open source. When you write the GraphQL query, what actually happens is that will then use the Gatsby Transformer Sharp plugin. And that Gatsby Transformer Sharp plugin will use the Sharp library to then generate the images in, whatever dimensions I want. And that works in the open source product like perfectly. And so the idea is that we're offloading that very process to a cloud function in cloud instead of relying on the single threaded, node process that runs on like a user's machine. But yeah, I honestly think, I've seen so many sites that have like a 5 or 10 megabyte like hero image. And so I'm just waiting for, that image to load. Or, even worse is I refresh the page or something and then like an image below the fold is like loading in and my page jumps. And so Gatsby image prevents both of those because we know what the image size is. And so we'll load in that small, base 64 image so that you don't see those weird jumps. You get this nice, Facebooky, medium-y, like blurring effect. And it's like a really great user experience without, having to be an expert in that like image optimization space. And honestly, like, I don't think a lot of people even know about the picture element. And like, if you haven't checked it out, like go check it out. It's really, really cool. And so I think that's one of the cool values of Gatsby is, we kind of are the performance experts. So it's like, hey, here's how the web should be. Like, here's an optimized image like looks like for the end user experience. And you don't have to be that same expert to get that benefit, which I think is really, really cool.
Yeah, it's always nice when the tool will push you towards the standard that you should know about and should be using.
Yeah, it's funny. I saw and heard that Jason Langsdorff was on this podcast like a year ago or something. And he said this a lot. I don't know if it's a Jason original, but I'll give him tons of credit. Let's say it is Jason original. But it's like make the right thing the easy thing. And I think that's kind of what we do with Gatsby, which is pretty cool.
If you like this show and you aren't listening to the Changelog, hey, let's fix that bug. The Changelog is our flagship show, and we've been doing it for over a decade. Adam and I seek out and interview the people who are pushing the world forward with software. We dive deep into the hacks, the innovations, and the leadership required to do what these amazing people do. One recent example is our conversation with Anders Damsgaard, a climate scientist from Denmark who gave us a peek inside his work and how he scratched a common itch he has when gathering academic research from around the web. Here's a dorky moment from that episode.
Are you trying to be right, or are you trying to solve the world's problems?
Exactly.
Like, if you're a scientist trying to be right, well, then your right may not actually be the right.
Yeah, exactly. There's another saying, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
I like that one. There's another saying, all models are wrong except for mine. Mine's correct.
Good one, Jared.
We had a lot of fun with Anders. He's a fascinating guy. Continue listening at changelog.com/podcast/378 or search for the Changelog on your favorite podcast app and find the episode called Open Source Meets Climate Science.
All right. So something that you said in that last piece talking about images and how it's all configurable got me wondering how configurable or accessible to developers is the Gatsby Cloud build process. And I have a particular use case in mind, something that I built for a site that I am hosting on Netlify. Mm-hmm. For each page, there's a thumbnail that if that thumbnail doesn't exist in my repository during the build process, it will auto-generate it. Mm-hmm. So it'll auto-generate a thumbnail for every page that does not already have one, at least within the context of blog pages. Mm-hmm. So I did that. They have these various ways that you can sort of hook into the build process as you go. And I'm kind of curious what Gatsby Cloud makes available to folks.
So without being intimately familiar with that exact use case and kind of like, seeing the code and like kind of what you're trying to do, it sounds like that's something that you would do in the open source product. And because the cloud product just uses, all the hooks, all the APIs that the open source product uses, it would just work in cloud. And so that, to me, based on kind of what you're saying, sounds like it could be like a Gatsby plugin. And so you could write that plugin, add it to your repo, or, better yet, like future state, Galaxy Brain has published it to the open source ecosystem. And then, let everyone get that benefit. And so again, this is a bit caveated because I don't know the exact use case, but that's probably how I would recommend doing it. And so cloud, being a consumer of the open source product, would just work the same way.
Awesome. So in some ways, then your statement for how would you hook into the build process is do it as a part of the general Gatsby build process. Cloud doesn't do anything different. Mm-hmm. It's just an extension, does it for you magically.
Exactly. Yeah. It's get it working in your Gatsby application, and that same process will, quote unquote, just work in cloud. Yeah. So it sounds like your use case is, so some blog posts don't have an image and then you just generate that image on the fly. Is it like based on the blog post contents, or is it like a placeholder image? Oh, cool.
Yeah. It's based on the content.
Jason Langsdorff, again, it's coming up again. He did some really interesting things about generating like an SEO image, which is pretty cool. And so he generated, he had a consistent, I think it's just his face, which is kind of funny, but it's like his face on the card and then like the blog post title and then like a short little description.
This is very similar, though I got it from Sean Wang, Swix.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Doing a similar thing. But yeah.
Funny how it all coalesces. So
It's a small world.
he wrote it as like a React component, and then it hooks into Cloudinary to like kind of generate that behind the scenes. I think even better yet is that could be a Gatsby plugin that will then generate that. So I'm getting really into the weeds, so I can broaden it up if we need to. But Gatsby has these low-level node APIs, and then those node APIs are then what makes a plugin do something. And so the idea here is that you could listen to when a node in Gatsby is created. So when a blog post is created, and then you could, at build time, construct that SEO image or that blog post image. And so that plugin would, again, just work in Cloud.
Another question, since we're in K-Ball Asks Questions this episode, apparently. So I was reading through the post that y'all did around like all the cool stuff that you did in 2019 and what's coming in 2020. And I noticed there was a huge focus on developer experience and DX. And I didn't see as much talking about user experience and user-facing stuff. And that may be because you feel like Gatsby's already rocking that and you're focused entirely on the DX. But I wanted to ask, what is currently missing in the Gatsby experience for developing amazing user experiences? Are there things where Gatsby needs some work, or that is on the roadmap or in discussion but not there yet?
Yeah, I have a first glib answer, and then I'll make it less glib. So the user experience, because Gatsby uses React, it's like there's probably a component for it in that space that does like exactly what you're doing. And so by user experience, you mean like nice components and like a nice interaction like in the application. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Potentially. I'm thinking about, so when we talk about developer experience, we're usually talking about how do we make it faster, easier, better for a developer to build what they're trying to get to. I'm thinking about, are there places that, some of what we talked about earlier, places where you can improve performance, reduce uncanny valleys, places where it's hard to do some particular type of user-facing thing, places that Gatsby is perhaps not the best fit from a user perspective, even if for a developer it would be delightful.
Yeah, so generally that's why we're a framework on top of React. So we've provided the right bells and whistles so that the user experience is as optimized as possible. And so you talked a little bit about performance optimization, because of course that has an impact on user experience. So it's like, you don't have to be a Webpack expert to get an optimized performant application with Gatsby. And so some really interesting things in this space. We actually did do, I don't know if they're encapsulated in this blog post or not. Oh, yeah, they are. So some like user-facing things is accessible routing. And so because we internalize the router, we use Reach Router today. And so we actually did a really focused effort on making Gatsby as accessible as possible by default. And so, of course, accessibility is like a spectrum. It's not like, oh, cool, my app's accessible, I'm done. There's leveling, there's varying degrees. Well, what we do with Gatsby is we kind of optimize, because we are the framework, we are the compiler, as much of that space as possible. And so what's cool about that is, you don't have to change your application to get those benefits. You just upgrade your version of Gatsby, and then you get them for free. So to your actual question as to, what things are maybe slated for more areas of improvement in user experience. Generally, I think we're hitting the mark there. It's, we've kind of optimized the things that we know about. We've provided the right level of, abstractions or I mean, it is a component at the end of the day, but the right level of nuance that you need for a good user experience. But it's definitely something that we're always thinking about. So like one of our key, reasons our CEO Kyle always says like, Gatsby is a tool that for him is a way to like create like delightful user experiences. And so it's like, we want to give the users all the control, all the power, all the right level of abstractions so that they can do that without being, a performance expert or without being an accessibility expert or, thing X, thing Y, thing Z. So definitely a good question.
You were talking about plugins. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on cool plugins that people should check out or really interesting community provided plugins for Gatsby?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would recommend going to gatsbyjs.org/plugins. So they're ranked by popularity, which honestly is probably not the best ranking mechanism. I think there are some really cool ones. So one of the nice things about having a plugin ecosystem is that you can encapsulate like a fairly complex thing or a fairly complex use case in a plugin that you can just get by npm installing it to a Gatsby config. So like some of my favorites are like Gatsby plugin offline. That will then generate a service worker, kind of do some like PWA type things, and will kind of cache your application offline once it's been accessed. And so again, any developer who has used or written service workers is like, oh, there are some dragons here. And so what's kind of cool about Gatsby plugin offline is we have vanquished at least all of the dragons that we know about. And so just by adding that plugin, you get this nice offline experience. Gatsby plugin manifests, same space. It's, I think a lot of the application space is moving towards making it more aligned with the web. And so this whole notion of PWAs, progressive web apps, like with just those two plugins, you get a pretty great progressive web app experience just by NPM installing. Beyond that, there's a lot. I mean, kind of whatever you'd like to do or whatever you'd want to do, there's probably a plugin for it. I think we have, nearly 2,000 plugins, which is pretty incredible. So for me, I feel like I'm coming here with like a lot of opinions and like hot takes, but I'm a big CSS and JS fan. And so there's like a lot of really cool plugins that, I like the developer experience, but oftentimes, there's like a runtime cost. And so with these Gatsby plugins, you can then generate ahead of time, that CSS file based on CSS and JS, and then statically optimize it as much as possible. So for instance, like there's a Gatsby plugin style components. And so the idea is that, use these abstractions that you as a developer likes, but then don't ship the cost of those abstractions to your end user. And so I think those are great ones too. Gatsby plugin TypeScript, previously mentioned Gatsby plugin React, you kind of, get a smaller bundle size. I think those are all some great ones. As far as like user generated ones, it's honestly hard to get like a handle on them because there's so many. And so some of the cool ones that have been, like even the ones that are in our repo, some of them have been contributed by users like originally. And so not only have they been, the initial creation of them, but then also some of the maintenance, some of the, hey, I found a bug, and then, a user comes in and fixes it for us. So that's, again, the value of being open source and having that great community behind us, which is just
totally
really amazing.
I kind of tying into that, into my next question is have you seen any like crazy or unusual use cases for Gatsby? I'm thinking, when I think about it, I'm going to try rewriting my blog with Gatsby. But going beyond that, I know it's way more powerful. What are some cool use cases that you've maybe seen or have thought about?
Yeah. Okay. So first, I'm going to comment on the blog one because I love it and I can refer to a great meme. So I don't know if anyone follows Mark Dalgaish on Twitter. He's like the meme master. So one of my favorite ones he ever did is he talked about writing a blog, and he was like, oh, I'll use TypeScript and I'll use Emotion, CSS&JS library, and I'll use like Webpack for like a blog that has 3 posts. And it's like, well, you don't really need this stack for, a static blog. It's not particularly interesting. Of course, again, Gatsby is a good use case for it. I get the memes pretty funny. As far as like actual, like novel use cases, this sounds a little arrogant. I think there's a kind of cool one I wrote called Gatsby Mail. And so it's, people think of Gatsby as its SSG. So it's like, hey, you can do apps with Gatsby. And so it's just a React application. And so the idea is that you generate as much as possible upfront ahead of time. And then you can, you have like a login experience. I use this tool called OneGraph, which is, again, a GraphQL. It's kind of like a GraphQL stitching service. So I can query from Twitter, from, GitHub, from Gmail. And so I did a small little, Gmail clone in 2 days. So clearly it's not Gmail level, but I think that's a pretty interesting one. It's open source. Look for Gatsby Mail. As far as other interesting Gatsby applications or, use cases I hadn't seen. Yeah.
Can I chime in with one?
Yeah, that'd be great.
There are some stunning e-commerce sites out there because e-commerce is one of these areas where we know there's hard data behind how performance inflects revenue and money and conversions and all of that. And there are some examples of e-commerce sites that are just so incredibly fast, you cannot believe it, and built with Gatsby.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So I didn't want to get too brandy, but yeah, if you go to our site showcase, some of the more common ones are e-commerce applications. And so, yeah, exactly what you're saying. E-commerce applications, especially, there's like a real dollars and cents value loss if your site's slow. And so the optimization, the kind of decoupling from your source of content makes for some really, really great, e-commerce applications. I think one of my favorites is Harry's, the razor. There is a women's variant called Flamingo, I believe, and it's a really great application, you can kind of see some of the benefits of Gatsby, and that like you get that like responsive image loading, gets great Lighthouse scores out of the box. So I also think Flamingo is another good one. So yeah, I'll share these links in Slack, but yeah.
This reminded me of another question that I have that I think I asked Jason about a year ago, and the answer was, well, not right now. And so I'm curious if the answer has changed, which is Gatsby has this incredible data layer we've been talking about that is all happening at build time. Is there anything to expose that kind of data aggregation and that GraphQL layer at runtime for if you're, for example, building out some of these applications that are more full featured that have some pieces that cannot be statically rendered, but still may need to access some of that data?
Yeah. So I would say, yeah, it's funny because the answer really hasn't changed there yet. So being in the React space and, because you're using GraphQL, we're kind of placing a bet there. And kind of like we're saying that in general, our application should be written in React, and then your data layer should be sourced in GraphQL. And so we're seeing like a proliferation of GraphQL APIs. And so the runtime handling piece there is, just use a GraphQL library in the React space. And then you can, because it's a dynamic application, you can then swap in, a component that might have a GraphQL connection to your actual API. As far as like exposing our GraphQL API, I think the really interesting space, and there's actually a CMS that's doing this, is generate ahead of time as much as you can, and then also like listen, with this GraphQL API with this, shared component. So I think it's Prismic. I believe it's Prismic. And so Prismic works pretty well with Gatsby, and so they're actually doing that. There's more to figure out there because there is a runtime cost to that. You're loading this bundle of JavaScript. And so the benefit is relatively clear to the end user. It's like I edit content and I don't need to wait for a rebuild. Like everything's up there. The idea is, future state is, what if you don't have to wait for a rebuild? What if your rebuild is like instant? You don't need to listen for that change.
Yeah. The use case that I'm interested in is for example, gated areas.
Yeah.
My understanding, and maybe this has changed too, but my understanding is to create a gated area within a Gatsby application, you basically make it client-side only. You don't pre-render.
Well, define what you're gating. Are you defining the whole experience or like a portion of it?
An authenticated set of pages or a logged in experience, something like that. Like those are all client-side rendered.
If there is content that can be generated ahead of time, you can, and then you can still gate it just by virtue of authentication and like using an API. You are right though that, let's say that you want, once you authenticate, then you have content that requires an API. It can't be built at build time. That is in Gatsby land, what's called client only routes. And so Gatsby Mail is an example of that. It's like, we can't generate your emails ahead of time because we don't know what they are. We don't know who you are. And so that is, value, I guess, of using React is that in Gatsby, it's a client only route. Use whatever data fetching mechanism that you like. Use whatever auth library you like. Could use Auth0, could use, your own one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it works just fine.
But if you want to mash that content up with some of the stuff that you're preloading in the data layer, right now, as I understand it, your SOL, you've got to go back to those original sources to load.
As far as I know, you can get the best of both worlds. So those, like if you think of like a user page, if there is something that can be fetched ahead of time, that will be rendered ahead of time. And then once it launches, then it's a React application. And so if you're rendering your footer and your header and hero image, and then like the body within is then the authenticated content, that would work just fine. It depends on the use case. It depends on exactly what you're doing. And I don't want to make too strong of a commitment because there's nuance to anything. Like person X's use case could be a little bit different and that answer wouldn't hold true. But generally that's what I like to do.
Can you pass that preloaded GraphQL content into the authenticated region? Because so the example that I'm thinking of is there's some amount of content here that is, or data that is global, and so could be pre-rendered. There's some amount that is authenticated or shielded, and it's not as simple as gating that by component because they're mashed together in some way. And so in my ideal world, I could basically use that pre-fetching layer for everything that's applicable, even if it's going into a piece of content that can't be pre-rendered.
Yeah, because we're in the React space, everything is really a component. So let's say that you have this component that is, let's say it's called the user or like, admin or something that would require a login to gate. So that component it's just a regular React component. So you can pass in props from something that has been statically generated. So because we invoke every React component with the results of the GraphQL query, you could then just use it at the call site. So that has a downside that's like props threading. So it's like at your base level, you have to pass this all the way down, and that can be a little burdensome. What Nick was referring to earlier, like, what we launched in 2019, one of the coolest ones, I think, is what's called the use static query. So it's a React hook that you can then query at build time with that GraphQL data, and you can use static query in a React component.
Oh, got it. Nice. Yeah. I see. So you generate your query at build time, it's going to load, and then you have a hook to pull that into whatever component, which could be down inside your authenticated stack or something like that.
Exactly. So from, main layout down to, sub footer component, like you can use static query, any layer, to kind of like thread in whatever you need. And so static query as like already existed as a component, but the hooks API makes it really easy to consume. So that's, again, like pure developer experience. That is a really nice feature of Gatsby. Yeah, it's a good question though.
Cool. I have one more question to kind of end us on, and that is going back to the open source side. What's the best way to get started contributing to Gatsby? Would that be to, just go into the repo and start looking at issues, find tests to write, or would it be to get started with the RFC process?
Yeah, that's great. So generally, I think the RFC would be for someone who's kind of more familiar with the Gatsby repo and really the Gatsby space and kind of like what we're looking for. But that being said, if that's where you start this journey, like that would be amazing too. Like I'm never going to preclude someone from starting there. So for someone who's kind of getting up and running with Gatsby and wants to kind of contribute, we try to label as much as possible all of our issues with good first issue. There's actually a really cool command line utility called good first issue, shockingly. So you can run like npx good-first-issue and then space name of the project. So npx good first issue Gatsby. And that will then show a list of like where you could get started. And so I think that's probably a really great way. Those are the ones, so they're categorized as good first issue, like intentionally, of course. They don't require as much context. They generally aren't, something like deep core internal thing that's like a little harder to discover and, requires a fair amount of context. And so that's a really great way to start. What's also amazing, and I'm like really like proud we have this program, is we have pairing sessions with the community. And so generally we want you to come with an idea or something to like work on, not just like, what is Gatsby? That's a little harder and like better served in like a video or something. You can actually go to our website and I can share this link in Slack. But if you just look for community pairing sessions, you can sign up with an open source maintainer and we'll kind of walk you through, getting your first contribution into Gatsby, which is pretty cool. So I think those are the two, best ways to get started. Of course, many of the core maintainers, Gatsby in general, is really open and welcoming to the community. So reach out to us on Twitter, let us know if you have an idea and we'd love to help guide you through your first contribution.
Awesome. I love that idea of being able to pair with a maintainer. Yeah.
Yeah. Super cool.
For sure. Yeah, it's been awesome, especially when, we can take someone without Gatsby context, kind of like help level them up. Like I think there's been a couple of examples of when we've taken someone from, what is Gatsby to I'm making a core change that required some context. And I think one of the key ways is through that pairing session. So it's been really successful several times.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Dustin, for joining us this week. Definitely check out Gatsby. It's a really cool project and can't wait to check in with the team next year. Cool. Well, thanks for joining us for another great party, a JavaScript party, and we will see you next week.
And thank you for listening to this episode of JS Party. We appreciate your time and your attention. If this show has helped you, entertained you, or brought you joy in any way, we would love a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Believe it or not, those reviews help more developers like yourself find the show. Special thanks to Dustin for bringing his knowledge and our friends at Gatsby for working with us. This episode was hosted by Nick Nisi with K-Ball and Chris Hiller playing wing. It was produced by Jared Santo, that's me, and our Farm Fresh beats are brought to you by BMC. Ooh, I was a poet, and I didn't even recognize the fact that I was. Thanks to Fastly, Linode, and Rollbar for helping us do what we do. That's all for now. We'll talk to you next time.
Alexa, do not disturb.
I won't disturb you.